It's a pleasure to welcome today my guest, Brenda Smit, all the way from Vancouver to eternity. Shortlisted in the 2018 Women's Journey of Faith contest, Brenda's memoir, When God Says No, My Journey Through Grief to Acceptance, chronicles her grief after her mother's untimely death and how, through grief, Jesus transformed her relationship with her alcoholic father. Originally from South Africa, Brenda and her husband live in Vancouver, British Columbia. Welcome to Eternity, Brenda.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So, your book is entitled When God Says No. This is your first book, I understand. What prompted you to write it, Brenda?
Well, it's a book about grief. And I think the main reason I wrote the grief was to survive my grief. Grief can be very debilitating. And Karen Blixen, who's the author of the novel Out of Africa, or the story Out of Africa, she once said that any sorrow can be borne if we put it into a story or tell a story about it. And so that really was the purpose of writing my book, is not to forget the situation I'd gone through with my mother, but also to tell the story so that I could survive it and heal through it and recover and go on to live a full life again.
So you are actually an audience of one in this initially. Who would you say is your other audience?
My other audience would be based, I think, on the three themes that are linked to the book. So the three themes would be, first of all, the story of my mom's death and dying. So an audience of people going through grief. The next audience would be those who have really deep questions of God, questions where we question our faith. We ask, why do good people suffer? Where is God in our suffering?
Yes.
Why does he sometimes feel so absent? So that would be another audience. And then there's a third theme in my book, which is the one you touched on in my introduction, with regard to my father and my relationship and his alcoholism. So it would also be an audience of people wanting to explore dysfunctional child-parent relationships. So it could be one audience that covers all three separate audiences.
So, Brenda, you mentioned your father just now. I thought it was very interesting because on page 66, you write, I had a deep sense that dad was committing a slow suicide. He had no reason to live. He had never acquired the skills to navigate life and resolve personal problems. He had never explored and come to terms with his emotions. And so, when his emotions overwhelmed him in his grief, he did what he has always done. He drank them into submission. Do you want to tell us more about your father?
Yeah, thank you. My father, I think, was a product of his generation. I think a generation where people didn't look into their emotions, particularly men. They didn't explore their hardships, their difficulties. And so from a young age, because of his difficult upbringing, he started drinking and smoking at just 9 and 12 years old. And so that really set the tone for the rest of his life. And when I've experienced that when people lose themselves in addiction, they actually don't mature emotionally.
Okay.
And so that I found happened with my dad. And that really played out in our relationship, where he was absent from me emotionally, he was absent from me, and not available to me. And it really was a difficult relationship for us right up until just before he passed away, when I went to visit him, which I chronicle in the book. And that was really a healing time that God gave us that was very unexpected, and an outcome actually of my mom's death and the grief we both experienced as a result of that.
That's very powerful. In your book, you explain that you wrote your memoir to free yourself from the guilt of forgetting and the torment of remembering. I love that line. Can you explain what you mean by that statement?
Yeah, it's very much related to my mom's death and her dying. I think what I experience and what I've seen in a lot of people is when we grieve, we're forced to deal with two things. The one is that to move on, we feel that we might forget this person, or we may forget the circumstances of their death or their life, and we don't want to do that. We think that by doing that, we're going to lose them. So there's this guilt of moving on and this guilt that we may forget them. And then if you've had the experiences I did where the death of your loved one was very traumatizing, if you keep that memory in you, it will torment you. And
Mm.
so I had this guilt of forgetting and wanting to move on, but afraid I would forget. And then if I kept the memory in me, it would torment me. So I found that by writing it, as you said initially, that audience of one, I could take that story out of me, put it on the page, and let it live on the page. And so
Mm.
anytime I wanted to go back and remember the history, the facts, the story, they were there for me to read.
I really like that perspective you bring to this
Mhm.
because I've been thinking on that statement as I was preparing for this interview. So thank you so much for penning it first. And secondly, thank you so much for explaining the depth of which healing can come
Mm,
through writing.
thank you. Yes.
So, Brenda, your memoir records not only your journey of grief after your mother's death, but also your spiritual journey and questioning of God. What would you say you learned about God through this time of questioning Him?
Mm. You know, I think I came through my mom's death to really feel like I was Job, wrestling with why do bad things happen to good people. And it took me even deeper to question, is Jesus real? Should I even bother following him? What's the purpose of following him? And I think those are real questions we all ask. And I feel they're questions we should ask if our faith is going to go deeper. And so what I learned through this is that God is very, very present to grappling with us and hearing our questions and able to receive our tough questions. And I found in my instance, which you would read in my book, I even found that he's quite capable of tough love too. And so as we grappled through this, I actually came to understand that God really is kind and he is good and he is loving, even though there may be circumstances that we feel say opposite. I found that that isn't the case.
Wonderful. I'd like to read what you wrote on page 31. Mark and I had discussed that we needed to stay on the right side of the nurses as we didn't know what they would do to mom when we weren't there. Their lack of care and compassion when we were there was hard enough to witness. This caught my attention, Brenda, because when I was in hospital, I too had a particular nurse that I described as sour. So I did not receive the best of care from that particular nurse. Can you tell me more about your mom's experience?
You know, I think perhaps I grew up thinking, well, I did. I grew up believing that nurses go into nursing because they care about people and they want to help people. And my experience with my mom in hospital was the exact opposite. I met nurses who didn't seem to care at all about their patients. I don't even know why they were nurses. I even asked one of the nurses, "Do you like nursing?" It seemed to be a way just to get a paycheck.
Mm.
And it was very traumatizing, not just to be with my mom while she was dying, but even to experience her lack of care and the apathy towards actually nursing her and caring for her. So yeah, it was mind-boggling for me and eye-opening. And yet surprisingly, and I say this with all due respect to nurses and medical professionals, as I've shared my story with others, they've also come back and said, "Oh, we've had a similar experience, just like you have." And that has just surprised me as to what's happened with medical profession in nursing, that sometimes there really is that lack of care.
Mm. And here I was expressing that same thing to
Mm.
you that I had experienced, and you know, it seems to be an international phenomenon here.
Which I was surprised, I really was surprised to pick that up, that many people seem to have had that experience.
On page 51, you write about how First Peter chapter 5 verses 6 to 7 spoke to you in your own anger. And that verse says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." So tell us about your whole process of trusting God, Brenda, and being angry at him, and how this verse settled you in the direction you should be going.
Yeah, that this came to me a few months into my grief with my mother, and it was part of that grappling and asking God, and He was quite happy with me to grapple with Him. But there came a turning point when, in reading that verse, I realized that as much as God is open to us grappling with Him, I found that for me, I needed to also trust him. I needed to rest and humble myself that even though my mom's death, the negligence of the medical staff, the fact that she didn't need to die, but she did die, were all unjust, God is still in control. And I needed to humble myself that he had a plan beyond what I knew and to actually rest in my grief. I think with grief, so often we fight against it. It's very painful, and to go to that place of deep pain is very, very difficult. So I
Mhm.
find that in reading that verse, letting go and stepping into and resting in my grief, God was promising me that He would raise me up once that process was complete, that process of perseverance, that process of grieving. And I needed to rest in that and trust in it.
A wonderful expression of faith. You also say, Brenda, that writing your story has gifted you a new way to live the rest of your life. I'm intrigued by that statement. Tell me more.
St. Irenaeus said that the glory of God is revealed in a person fully alive. And that struck me. And so I realized too, in coming through my grief, I had a choice. I could continue to live as a bird with a broken wing, grieving, struggling, perhaps angry at God, or I could fully trust that He knows what He's about. And I could fully trust that in this life we will have trouble and we will have suffering, but He is in control and He has already won the battle and redeemed the world. In which case, that frees me up to fly fully healed, fly with my wings open wide, and to live life again, totally engaged, totally finding the joy that He has for me, taking my grief with me into the future and not feeling like it's something that I have to constantly grapple with. And so that's really where I find that it's given me the freedom to live life again.
It certainly sounds that you have found that freedom, Brenda.
Thank you.
What do you hope the reader will glean from this book, When God Says No?
I think what I hope is what I've actually picked up from other readers who've reached out to me is that in reading my story, they'll actually find their story in it. So
Mhm.
perhaps it's a story of grief, perhaps it's a story of questioning God, perhaps it's a story of a dysfunctional relationship with a parent or knowing how to live again. So it depends what the reader brings to the book and what they're hoping to get out of it. But my hope would be that it would be healing in whichever area they need that, and just a deeper understanding of perhaps what it is and why they have that particular hurt.
And I like that you have identified a number of scenarios through which someone can benefit from this book because it truly is transferable. There are transferable concepts of grace and mercy and the healing of God and the love of God and just finding hope in the darkness. I
Mhm.
mean, so many people struggle with alcoholism or they have it in their family. So many people have an ill member in their family. So many people face the death and the
Mhm.
consequent anger they feel towards God and the questions they ask of why not, and it constantly goes around in their head over and over. And I really like how you have taken your situation, how you have dissected it, and how you have come to a place. You have shown us how you move from point A to point B to point C until you're finally at rest in the heart of God. So, if our viewers would like to buy your book, where can they get it?
The easiest place to buy it would be from Amazon online. That's the simplest, easiest way. And to actually search for the book under my author name, which is Brenda Smit-James, Brenda Smit-James. But you can also get it from your local bookstore. If they're not carrying it, then you can just approach them and ask them to order it for you from Word Alive Press.
Okay. So this show is called Eternity. You are bound for heaven. How did you come to know the Lord?
You know, it's a question of, I think my whole life. I grew up in a liturgical home where I really came to know and love God the Father. And so I grew up with that love in my heart. But it was when I was 13, the Gideons came to my local high school and they did a presentation from the front of the school and they told us about the gospel and the love of Jesus. And that was the day I went home with my little Gideon Bible and I wrote the date in there and I said the sinner's prayer and I opened my heart to the Lord. But it was 10 years later when I was 23 and had wandered a little bit from the Lord, and I was at a Methodist church and there was a Jewish man who had become a Methodist pastor. And he really gave a message that explained to me what it is to actually let Jesus not only into my heart, but actually to be Lord of my life. And that he actually takes over my life and I live my life through him. And so that was really, I think, maybe the 3-phase steps I've been through to come to know the Lord.
Yes. Every knee shall bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord.
Yes.
And you brought back a fond memory of my own school days where we received Bibles from the Gideon. Little red ones, little testaments, red ones or green ones. And the Gideons did a great work of making sure that we heard the gospel. How precious that is indeed.
That's right, yes.
Brenda, do you have a final word for our viewers?
You know, what God has really impressed on me is what I touched on earlier, and which is really a theme, I think, through my book, is that life is full of trouble. And I think we often hear a message today that life should be easy. And I think one of the things my mom always wished for us as children is that we would be happy. And I think that's a wonderful wish. But I think more important, it's important to know how to deal with the difficulties in our lives and how to bring God into those difficulties so that we can be happy, so we can live lives of joy. So I would just encourage your viewers that wherever they happen to be in their life, whatever difficulties they may be enduring, to reach out and find a way in which they can actually move forward in the Lord. There is a way forward, and difficulties hone us. They teach us perseverance, which gives us our Christian godly character. And they have purpose.
Wonderful. And that purpose lies in Jesus Christ. And friends, towards the end of the show, I will be telling you how you can spend eternity with God the Father. Brenda, I want to thank you so very much for taking the time to discuss with you your most wonderful book, your testimony, your message of inspiration, encouragement, and hope to people who grieve, no matter what the situation. When God Says No by Brenda Smit-James. May you find comfort as you journey along. And friends, may you also find healing and comfort through Brenda's book, When God Says No. Thank you very much again, Brenda, for being my guest on Eternity today. God bless you.
Thank you, Susan, for the opportunity.